The reality is, as a soldier, this is probably the first time in my 30 plus years where there's a genuine growth trajectory. And that's in sort of UK nationally, that's in sort of Europe collectively, and NATO as a whole. NATO is stronger because of Ukraine. And I think the decisions NATO has made means that, for the first time, defense is a growth business, and that's a fundamental change.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Future of GovCon. This is a weekly podcast to bring together experts from across the industry and look at what's happening today and how it's going to impact the future of our industry. I'm Jake Frazer. I'm the owner and CEO of Precision Talent Solutions. Leading one of the industry's top executive search firms, I get to talk to influencers every day. C-suite executives, board members, growth leaders, top government officials, military flag officers. And on this podcast, what we're doing is we're bringing in these experts from AI, from space, from medical, from logistics, from engineering. And we're sitting down and talking about what's happening in their specific area of the industry and how it will impact the future. So pour a cup of coffee and let's get started. Hey everybody, welcome back for another episode of the Future of GovCon, where we bring in the brightest minds around our industry and talk about where things are heading. Today, we are very lucky to have with us Major General Adrian Reilly. He's not retired yet, so we're still going to call him General Reilly, who is joining us today. Adrian, welcome to the podcast.
Jake, good morning, and thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
I'm always, Adrian and I met at a reception that we hosted on the sidelines of DSEI in the late summer, early autumn last year, and we hit it off. And he's got a fascinating career story, and he's got one of the coolest jobs right now, where Adrian is the director. Let me make sure I get this right. The director of Ukraine capabilities for the UK MOD. Is that right, Adrian?
Yeah, that's right. And it's completely different to anything I've done beforehand, but it sort of brings together a little bit of sort of financing sort of policy, but importantly, sort of equipment sort of support where we can do in terms of industry and partners to be able to support Ukraine in whichever ways we can do. So it's been clear mission, real purpose, but it's been huge learning as well. It's been a great way to come to an end of a career.
So for our audience that's been watching this space, I think most of you have, Adrian's been working on the Ukraine challenge for the last 3 years at a very high strategic level, essentially as the lead for the UK MOD. So we're excited to get his perspective on that. And he also has a fantastic career leading Scotsmen, infantrymen, armor. I don't know if were you ever a cavalryman?
No, never a cavalryman, always an infantryman, but armoured infantry on the way throughs.
Okay.
That was a great privilege. Kilts and armoured infantry don't go together, so they were sort of separate parts of life.
Very cool. Well, good. Let's get to know Adrian a little bit. Adrian, talk a little bit about your growing up. I think you had a bit of an international experience growing up. So talk about being a young man.
Yeah, so my family were originally in East Africa. My mother grew up out there. Her parents had been there from the end of the Second World War. So we were variously in Uganda, Tanzania, and also Ethiopia for a bit. So a sort of young life in East Africa before coming back to the UK for school, as many expatriate families did. And then my family sort of resettled back here in the UK in the sort of the late 80s, where we were in Scotland. And that was brilliant because my mother's from a Scottish family, despite having lived overseas, and so it was sort of kind of coming home. It was always part of the idea of coming home, and that was really where I ended up with sort of local regiment, family regiment, in this sort of British way of having sort of a long history that goes with it. So it was a brilliant sort of adventure as a child, but then ended up sort of back home in the UK in the north of.
How did growing up in East Africa shape you, like in your early years? How did it shape you for the rest of your career?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting. So I think there's adventure to it. I think anywhere where there's a challenge to living, and there were challenges to living at that stage. East Africa wasn't the most stable of places. I think the sort of sense of big outdoors with just sort of adventure that went with it. So I think I can always remember adventure, sort of challenge, the sort of this sort of fun of just being around people. It's kind of the ethos of being in the military. It's good people, good challenges, and having the opportunity to make the most of it. So I think I remember it really fondly. I suspect from a family point of view, it was quite a challenging place to bring up young children, and I probably didn't see that part of it. But from a child's point of view, it was romantic. It was exciting.
I think it gets in your blood, in your genes. Like as a kid, we traveled. My dad was stationed in Europe. We traveled all over Europe, and I think I couldn't imagine just having a boring linear life. When I started making life choices, right?
Yeah, and I think you're right. There's also that sense of what I would see is never really sort of having a place where I would say is home. There was always that sense of next adventure, next place, and I think that helps with military service because exactly as you say, you end up moving around, doing lots of things, and it gets in your sort of bloodstream for it. Rather than being fixed in a place where you know everybody, you know everything, and that's where you call home, and that's where you want to be.
You pass that on to your kids too now, right? That sense of adventure.
Yeah, we'll see. So my children are now sort of young adults. One who's looking at military service as an option, but we've never really got involved in that. But his choice, and really excited for him if he follows that path. Another who's moved into the world of international relations, which is what she's doing her undergraduate degree in at the moment. And actually, it's great. So some of the conversations we have as she realised that what I do is quite useful to her course. It's been brilliant. Yeah. So where that ends up, don't know. We'll see.
Dad actually knows something, right?
It was a surprise. Yeah, it was a surprise, but it's been good.
And military services in the family, right? You're a dual service married couple. Is that right?
We are, and so for the next little while before I'm fully retired, we remain the UK's senior serving army family. So the two of us together, and that's caused challenges through time. So we were commanding officers together at the same time at the unit level, but we were separated by hundreds of miles and commuting using sort of cheap airlines at weekends. But so that was the challenge. The benefit's always been that there was somebody you could turn to. So when people talk about loneliness at command and that sort of challenge of having to do everything yourself, we always had someone that you could, genuinely have a conversation with, that you could say, how do you feel about this? And so challenges and strengths. And I'm deeply proud that my wife is now a senior officer with a real potential. And it's brilliant because it's a role model to young women, but it's also a role model to families, which is important.
She's the second woman to reach the rank of 3 stars, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I would joke at home that makes me the aide, the driver. But in reality, I'd probably do less of the home stuff than, on balance, it's not an equal part.
Yeah. So how do you draw the line on shop talk? I mean, you come home, you both have all this in your head.
So for the most part, most of our portfolios have never really overlapped. So yes, in leadership roles, you sort of kind of test things that are on your mind. But for the most part, we've worked in different parts of the business. So I ended up in sort of headquarters and sort of strategy and plans and commitments type jobs. And she has become a real specialist in terms of sort of the delivery of capabilities. So has specialized in her later career around about sort of procurement, capability development and delivery. So in many cases, there weren't that many things that we overlapped on. So that made life easy. And actually, when you get home, there's many more important things than dealing with what happened in your day.
Yeah, I have good friends, the Letchers. She was retired as a 1-star. He was a colonel, but man, they were on the road all the time. 3 boys, but they all turned out fine. So, well, good. That's great. Talk about your military career. Like, how did you decide to go in the military? What tripped your trigger to do that?
I don't think I really remember a time where I didn't want to be in the military, and whether that's because we were a generation that was really only one remove from those that sort of fought in the Second World War, and then all of those sort of conflicts through the sort of 50s and 60s. So to whether that had an influence or not, I don't know. And I kind of always wanted to do it. And part of it was a challenge. Part of it was it should be difficult. I kind of like the idea of, if it's tough, have a go at it. So I went straight from school. I left school at 18, went straight to Sandhurst, which was not uncommon in the sort of the early 90s. Although, these days we look for people who've got a little bit more experience, quite often as undergraduate degrees, and just probably a little bit more mature. So I did an apprenticeship in the military, really, which was a brilliant way to grow up overseas, in a place where, compared to today, there was no sort of easy flights home. There was no sort of internet connection. It was, you were genuinely deployed with your friends and colleagues, and it was brilliant. So yeah, straight from school, I've done nothing but sort of leave school, join the military. So the fact that I'm coming to the end of it is one of those sort of moments of, I'm going to have to think about actually getting a job at some point. This is the first time ever.
What now?
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah. What was your first deployment?
So I started in Berlin. So my unit was in Berlin. So I was out there in 1990, the end of 92. And at that stage, the Russians were still there. So you had the quarters. The Americans were there, the French, UK, and Russians. And so you go for breakfast in the French Quarter. You get great croissants. You go across the American Quarter for the PX. Everyone would buy Leathermans, and then you could still see the Russians around. They left during our time, and that was just a huge piece of history. But Berlin was in a sort of party state. The wall had come down, the unification of Europe, the end of sort of the Cold War. There was a real positivity around it, but with a legacy of sort of all that gone before it.
How did that shape you, just starting out there for your career?
So I think what it did is it puts you in context. So I did the last of the big NATO exercises, where we exercised the withdrawal from Berlin. Although I slightly wonder how much the Berlin force would have been able to withdraw. That's a hypothetical. So we did a sort of NATO exercise, huge withdrawal across sort of swathes of private land back to the River Weser, where the second line defence was established. That was over sort of 6 weeks, and it was with very little notice. So there was no big exercise these days. You get a year's worth of notice. You prepared for it. That was done on an active edge. Button was pressed. You got to your vehicles and you started driving. You had no idea when. So you got an idea of scale. You also got a sort of idea of readiness. And I think you could just see this sort of big European theatre, how it was set. That's looking backwards. As a 19-year-old sort of soon leader, I was learning, how do you deal with people? How do you deal with the sort of technical stuff? There was lots of things I got wrong. There was lots that was just learning about your trade. So there's a balance between the personal and the sort of the big system. Probably looking back, I think about the big system.
Yeah, I remember reporting to my first platoon. I was 21, 22 years old, and I was probably the third youngest guy in the unit. Trying to be in charge but not be the boss.
So,
right?
Yeah, and some brilliant senior sort of enlisted leaders who were just patient, who were brilliant at sort of just helping you develop as an individual, giving you some boundaries and sort of pushing you to go beyond it. And it was never about the physical. It was like, could you run fast enough? Of course you could. Did you know the tools? Yeah, but putting it into action, that sort of development pathway was incredible.
So talk about your career path. You other deployments or high points in your career that helped form to who you are today.
So I sort of say Scottish Infantry Regiment. What we did was, in those early days, we bounced in a lot to Northern Ireland, internal security tasks, and that was on short deployments in sort of high risk places, and also some longer deployments over sort of a couple of years.
Was that still during the Troubles? Was that still really active? Huh?
Yeah. So my first deployment was into South Lamar sort of before the first of the big ceasefires. And then even after the first of the ceasefires and they got into the negotiations, there are a number of events that sort of kind of happened. So I think that was an incredible testing ground for young leaders. Your troops very quickly got to a conclusion of whether they trusted you and whether they would give you the authority to lead. And it was an amazing testing ground for young military people in the British Army. But of course, actually, the resolution was important. And there were times where certainly my first deployments, we had 30,000 troops. really small territory of 6 provinces. It was a big commitment. So a lot of time in Northern Ireland, which then led into you sort of move through the ranks, and you get more and sort of more responsibility as you go, and then into the sort of the period of time which was through the Balkans, and actually the Balkans I got to the late end of sort of the point, so the stage at which NATO I thought was all pretty established. It wasn't sort of the early chaotic days, and then naturally that leads to Iraq, and a bit of time cycling through in Basra and beyond, and actually then latterly I had a sort of brief stint dealing with some Libya type activity, but then I've ended up in headquarters jobs, in policy jobs, and that sort of senior end where you think you can still be an infantryman, your knees don't, and you're kind of stuck in sort of helping to make the right decisions. So that's where I've been most recently.
So talk about interfacing with industry, with government contractors. When did you first come in contact with government contractors, and talk about your experience there?
So I think as I look at it, there were definitely government contractors around Northern Ireland, but I was too junior, too tactical really to sort of understand it. And there was a lot around about sort of physical base protection. There was a lot of sort of electronic surveillance type business, and so there was quite a lot going on. But it was above me, and I didn't understand it. I think the first time I properly saw sort of government contracting was in Iraq. After the early part of the invasion, the big organisations like KBR coming in, setting up huge bases, dealing with sort of all of the sustainment and supply sort of a force, and in that sense, I think I was still really a sort of tactical commander, and I kind of appreciated that this was all being delivered, but didn't think about the sort of consequence of the balance of force, balance of risk. Actually, how do you enable a mission? So that was my sort of first real introduction to it, and then latterly, it's much of my conversations have been around about sort of this sense of the balance between industry, commerce, government contracting, and the mission. How do you create an end-to-end sort of capability that includes the best of all of those pieces, so that people are focused on the mission? That's been my latter part of the career.
Do you remember the point in your career where you saw the contractors no longer as them but as us, where they became truly part of your capabilities?
Yeah, and I think I think that is, for me, most recently, it was probably getting into sort of strategy and plans jobs at the sort of the MOD strategic level, where actually that enablement was, it was a lever, it was a tool, and it wasn't something that was transactional. It was absolutely sort of, you could see mission focus from the organizations who were dealing with. They brought capabilities that just aren't core military business, and they were good at it. So I think as we started getting into sort of planning above the operational level in terms of how do we deal with problems, quite often contractors have solutions that the military, it's just not their business.
Yeah, you could see the I mean, of course, I was in the Balkans as a soldier, and I saw the brown root guys, soon to be KBR. I mean, they were everywhere, and they built all that infrastructure and brought us our hot food and hot showers. And later I got to work there as a brown and rooter, going out and liaising with the task force. And I began to realize they were very reliant on our ability to fuel and feed and move their equipment so they could execute their mission. And I felt like, well, that's when we became we instead of them and they. We became a we kind of mission there in the Balkans. And I think that was kind of the breeding ground that mindset was then permeated as we went into Iraq and Afghanistan and Kuwait and all these other places. And now it's so integrated, right? It's part of the force.
Yeah, it is. And even I can go back to probably being a divisional headquarters. I was a grade 3 staff, so I'm really junior. But I was on the G3 desk. Actually, our biggest concern was always about engine spares and tech. And all of that was being moved around by contractors. It couldn't have happened otherwise. With tank transporters, which were actually a collaboration between a sort of commercial organization with part-time reserve military drivers. The integration of that was huge. So even down to, can I get a replacement engine for my tank? And they were facts that we were tracking in great detail. Everyone thinks sort of the G3 shop is all about sort of big plans and sort of being sort of clever about how you do stuff. Actually, it's about the physics of being able to do it. The decision was the sort of the generals.
So you, in kind of the evening of your military career, you've been focused on the challenge in Ukraine. And probably not just from a UK perspective, but from a holistic perspective, right? So talk a little bit about your role there, what you've been focused on.
Yeah, so you're right. It's definitely not the UK. It's sort of an international sort of group of people who see justice and sort of Ukraine's right to defend itself and to make its own choice and where it is. So it's sort of partnership internationally. More than 50 nations who are actively and routinely working together to support Ukraine with what it needs when it needs it in order to be able to defend against the sort of the invasion and to make its own choice. So one very small part of that, but actually a really privileged position, unusual background in terms of sort of Miltech, no capability procurement background, but finding myself in a place where, because of just where I was and the relationships I had, that I could sort of bring something to it. So what I've been doing is been working for a little while, working between sort of the political layer, where sort of decisions are made, sort of national capital decisions. It's sort of fundraising and working with fundraisers to be able to sort of get the resources to be able to, and then matching politics and money to capability. And it's all well and good saying, it's like the sort of Second World War problem. You can build the best thing, but unless you can deliver it and Ukraine can use it, it's no good whatsoever. So what does Ukraine need? How do we get it? How do we get it there at the time of relevance? And I think this has challenged an awful lot of thinking around about sort of supplies, stocks, innovation, consumables. It's been that whole sense of how do you in a war of industrial capacity gear up your industry to be able to be on the winning side. You go back to how many meters of shipping, tons of shipping the US managed to produce between 1942 and 1945. That's war winning type stuff. And so how do we, when we're not at war, build the industrial capability response to be able to give a partner that we are politically committed to supporting defend its nation, actually to be able to defend its people and to be able to get to the outcome that they deserve.
How do you feel about, because this is bigger than Ukraine, this is about, the 5%, the 3.5%, the NATO pledge for spending. I think Ukraine's kind of a specific use case for that, right? It's creating some urgency. How do you feel like the European plus UK, you're still Europe in my book. How do you feel like industry is actually positioned to support that from a production, but I'm also thinking from a services side, which is where I've grown up on the service, the deploy, sustain, maintain. How's that shaping what industry should be doing right now?
So I think Ukraine's shown us some really valuable insights. So I think it's challenged that sort of neatness of precision strike, the application of sort of lethal force in a way that allows you to be able to be really quick and sort of the outcome is assured. And I think it's taken us back to the sense of there's a real challenge in terms of enduring conflict, of sustaining and delivering sort of all of that industrial support. So that's been a massive lesson. And I think, of course, what we need to also do is appreciate just how much Ukraine has done to secure NATO's eastern flank in facing an enemy that we never want to. And actually, we should be we should celebrate their courage and sacrifice all the way through that. They've been extraordinary. So I think NATO's recapitalization. This is, I mean, in terms of it's political, it's not for me to come to. But the reality is, as a soldier, this is probably the first time in my 30 plus years where there's a genuine growth trajectory, and that's in sort of UK nationally, that's in sort of Europe collectively, and NATO as a whole. NATO is stronger because of Ukraine, and I think the decisions NATO has made means that for the first time, defence is a growth business, and that's a fundamental change. And I think there's some really fascinating stuff coming out of this. So I think for investors, not necessarily government money, but I think sort of private and sort of other capital. Actually, defence is a worthwhile market. I think from an industrial point of view, where we've been running at sort of a defined product level, we're now talking about systems that are always on, innovating, who are trying to be at the leading edge of technological advantage for battlefield advantage. And I think when you bring those things together, NATO strengths, increasing cash, and the fact that industry is part of battle winning, it's not just a warehouse. It's absolutely got to be there. And I think my biggest observation of this is that it's no longer about sort of products and product stocks, but it's about a system that can take battlefield intelligence, that can integrate across a range of capabilities. And it's all about gaining initiative and advantage. As any military person will know, it's that whole sense of how do you get the advantage in the battle space. So this is a time like I haven't known, and it's a really exciting.
The recapitalization of the defense industrial base. I haven't heard it put that way. Where do you think we're missing investment in that space? Where do you see the gaps right now?
So I think it depends, and I think it comes down to there are a number of really well-established sort of defense companies who actually genuinely make some incredible capabilities. And some of those capabilities, huge demand in Ukraine. And the order books for some of these companies are telling the story of just how valuable they are. I think the difference now is that the growth of small, medium enterprises, and a lot of them no longer small or medium, because if they've got capability that works, integrates, and has battlefield advantage, they are attracting cash. And therefore, that is transformative. It's no longer just about primes. There's a genuine competition. I think it comes down now to this sort of sense of what does price modeling look like going forward. So rather than what's the return on a product range, and therefore per item sort of profit margin, I think now we're moving to a world which is probably about sort of contracting for service. It's about contracting a relationship that says, look, we're in this with you. I think the presence of science and tech right up at the front line in Ukraine, where you see Ukrainian troops who are dealing in code, so troops who are sort of recoding capabilities, who are absolutely aware of the electromagnetic spectrum and how they exploit it, both for defense and offense. And therefore, this sort of tech is all the way forwards. It's no longer you unbox something and use it, and you're part of the system. So I think the big change is going to come in terms of it's contracting for service, of consumables, sort of system that works. And I think it's about sort of the integration of tech all the way forward, so that it's no longer, you don't take something out of a box. You're part of a system. And that's going to change how money flows in this sort of work.
Yeah, I think there's, you pointed out your traditional primes, their backlog is so big now that there's not much capacity there. There needs to be a new layer that comes in, and it should be attracting private equity and venture capital funding, right? Because it should be seen as an attractive, profitable sector to get in. And I guess my question is, what are the European MODs doing to kind of stimulate this idea, bringing in non-government money, but real investor money into the market?
So I think, so I think first of all, there's an impression that says prime's bad, sort of young, innovative is sort of small companies really good, and I don't think that's true. I think some of the primes have been amazing in how they've responded. and the demand for some of the capabilities they provide is through the roof. Just shows they're doing the right thing. So I think there's a range of there's good primes, there's sort of primes that are more challenged. There's good innovators, but there's also a lot of people who are trying to get into a market and secure a position without necessarily having something that's that useful to begin. So I don't think there's a divide between good and bad in terms of industry. They're all sort of separate. I think the whole sort of how do you draw investment? I think governments can create the opportunity, but I think this is for capital markets to make their own choices around. And whereas defence has been for a long time, not necessarily you can make a better return, through pharma. You can. There are lots of places you could get better return on investment. I think now we see not only a sort of moral choice around about sort of national resilience, security, which is influencing, but I think also the growth market just helps shareholders and businesses make different decisions. And the challenge at the moment is, if you're a multi-billion sort of dollar organization, actually to be able to get a sort of 5%, 10% return on it, you've got to get some big money for it. That money's coming around, I think, with NATO changing its posture and its funding. It hasn't done yet, so they haven't necessarily moved. I think if you're a $100 million business, getting a 5% return on that, you can do in the Ukrainian theatre. So I think what Ukraine has shown is that money will flow to where capabilities are. I don't think enough money has flown yet to incentivize the primes to be at the leading edge of that. That competition is good. And I think as the money changes through NATO, then we'll see industry respond to it, and the capacity is there.
So let's go back to Ukraine, because we kind of went macro talking about European defense, but let's go back into Ukraine. Where do you see need right now for companies to be investing to support this next phase? As hopefully we get to some sort of armistice or ceasefire or maybe a peace deal. Where would you be investing if you're in our audience out here? You're a defense services company, you're an equipment provider. Where would you be investing to support this next phase of what's going on in Ukraine?
So hopefully we do get to a new phase shortly. It's sort of this war has got to end. It is going to end, and actually genuinely hope that it ends. With justice for Ukraine through it. So when that phase comes, I think the challenges are sort of there are lots of challenges. I think the whole of the world is going to be sort of given opportunities through. Ukraine needs to restructure, rebuild from an infrastructure level. It needs to reestablish its sort of trade mechanisms, sort of port infrastructure, ability to be able to actually be a wealthy and sort of sustainable nation. But it's also going to have to rebuild its defense. And it also probably needs to move from its current defensive structure to one which is much more threatening in a deterrent sense. So deterrence by denial, deterrence by punishment of any future Russian engagement. And I think that's been the case from the start coming forward. So having realised that actually, the previous peace agreements didn't hold because that wasn't there. So there's going to be a transition. Huge amount of building, huge amount of sort of work from energy through health, through sort of governance, through sort of just, reestablishing Ukraine as a sovereign, defended, safe nation, safe skies, safe seas, and safe territory. So I would say for any businesses out there, the sense of the market's there. And it's going to be too big for any single business, too big for any single nation. It's genuinely going to be challenges going to be coordinating all of those things. And I think, in that sense, from physical defense hardening through to the sort of generation of a depth of magazine with sort of long, mid, and close range strike and defense, and also the rebuilding of what Ukraine has. Its capabilities have been hit hard. So in terms of just basic engineering of sort of rebuilding all the platforms that they're using that sits inside it. So it's a massive challenge. And I think we already know that, that's many hundreds of sort of billions of dollars worth of sort of work that needs to be done. And I have a confidence that the international community in a sort of, response will be keen to meet that. And that there is there is an opportunity not only for the good of Ukraine, but for business to actually get up.
I assume you've been working with SAG-U, the Security Assistance Group Ukraine, and INSAT-U on demand signals from Ukrainians, right? Because that's what's Ukrainians are giving their demand signals to these organizations. Are they giving strong demand signals as we're being optimistic about having some sort of resolution? Have those demand signals changed from, defensive / offensive requirements right now, tanks and things like that, to air defense and UXO removal? And are they giving like once things happen, then we're going to move to a new set of requirements?
And I think that's been a real challenge in some, and there is a genuine question about if you project forwards too much, then you give people the opportunity to focus on it. It's okay. I'm going to deal with sort of unexploded UXO. I'm going to deal in sort of the regeneration of sort of damaged combat vehicles, and actually before that, Ukraine's got to win the fight tonight. And actually, so there's this sense of keep the focus on fight tonight, but think about tomorrow. And so there is a really well developed Ukrainian plan. It's their plan, designed by them. There's no point telling them what the answer is of what the future could look like, and how they transition at a sort of phase change towards that. So there's a good sense of what that is, but it's not the focus at the moment, and the demand set isn't there yet. What it does do is influence choices you make now. So the international community responded with a huge amount of sort of support from their own infantries at the beginning of the war. But if you take that down to a basic level, there were lots of different systems that weren't designed to operate together necessarily, put onto the battlefield. And that created logistics and command challenges, and even just operator challenges across the board. What understanding the future allows us to do is, if we understand what future platforms, what future capabilities we do now, is make fight tonight choices based on the knowledge of what does the future look like. So if you've got a particular tank that you don't see in the future, don't resource that.
Right.
Don't focus on that as your priority. Focus on the things that will endure. So the future is informing now, but everybody's focus remains on it's here, it's now, it's the urgency of the fight.
So how do you see this? We had a guest previously, a member of parliament, Adrian came in, Andre, I'm sorry, I'm not going to try and say his last name, I'll mess it up. So he's an active member of parliament, and he was kind of he'd been the ambassador or the envoy to South Korea, spoke fluent Korean, and he had this idea, he has this hypothesis that the war will end in a similar fashion as the Korean War. It's like a Korea model. So not Major General Reilly's opinion, but Adrian Reilly. How do you see this thing unwinding? What do you see happening, and when do you see it happening?
And when is a really difficult. So that's a ultimately there's very few people that can really define the when, and it's going to come, as I think most conflict does, to a sort of point of it's a point at which it's either by exhaustion of people and resources, it's by some form of international pressure that comes to it, and within that, I think there's also a sense of the what. I think this comes down to Ukraine has to be able to be comfortable that their sacrifices and that everything that it stood for to protect is protected off the back end of that. So I think ultimately how will come down to resource and time. It will come to a point at which one side just can't endure any more than that. Now Russia's making a judgment that that'll be Ukraine first. From what I see of the Ukrainian people, their resilience, their fighting for their freedom, they are, that is just the most remarkable, just fighting spirit. They are the unity, the focus is admirable. I don't meet Russians and don't talk to them, but I wonder quite how much their sort of forces are driven by that same sort of motivation and that sense of purpose. I don't know. I can only assume. So I think Russia's calculating that Ukraine will fall over, and I don't see it at a personal level. I don't see it at an international level, and I think that's a misjudgment. But time will show. Ultimately, it's unlikely in the near term that Ukraine will recover all of the territories that it's lost. And so it's likely that there's going to be some form of frozen line. And I doubt the international community will accept that as a sort of a change forever. But I think we'll be in a place where actually, if we secure Ukraine, it's a national decision to be Western aligned, to be able to be a democracy that builds in its own vision without any interference or manipulation. And I think that's a win for Ukraine in the long term. And I think that's going to be hard for Ukrainian people. They've suffered incredibly. That they probably will end up with some form of territorial line, but they will end up free and able to make their own choices.
Do you see like we had in Bosnia, a zone of separation and a peacekeeping force coming in?
I think all of that depends on how does the conflict end, what are the sort of conditions around, because we can't sort of, and this is part of the problem of predicting forwards is there's a lot of assumptions around it. So yes, you could assume that there will be a hard line, there will be a sort of area of separation that will be monitored by some form of technical or sort of military force. And there'll need to be some form of arbitration organization that looks over sort of violations of what that looks like and holds that through a sort of international legal sort of process. That would feel like a good assumption. But we don't know because there's still quite a lot to play through before that happens. And that, of course, then sets conditions around what does a future security architecture look like? What are your priorities at the point at which peace comes?
So same goes for any use of a coalition of the willing for like a stabilization. That all just depends, right?
Yeah, and I think coalition of the willing, which is again sort of an international commitment to support Ukraine in the regeneration. So it's not a defense force per se. It's about supporting a partner in regeneration of their sovereign capability in order that they can defend and deter. And I think that international commitment, you look to it's sort of more than 50 sort of of the world's most wealthy nations coming together in unified support, and those nations supporting a future security architecture which includes reinforcing and supporting Ukraine the best.
Seem to be a mission within the mission. If they do that, there's got to be a mission to support any kind of stabilization force or peacekeeping force, similar to the Balkans, right? You'll have deployed foreign troops. They're going to need life support and equipment and sustainment, just like in the same time rebuilding and reestablishing the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and all of its capabilities.
Yeah, and within that, even just sort of establishing, sort of Ukraine was rushed into this war. They didn't choose it. Wasn't So Ukraine was rushed into it, and despite the fact they've been fighting since 2014, that was over Crimea. That was reasonably contained. I think now you see the likelihood that it's a huge map from reinforcing forward defences to building secure ammunition stockpiles and access to them, looking at the sort of the infrastructure of roads, bridges, rail as a means to supporting military activity. So that's just at an infrastructure level. Then you're going to have to look at sort of like all of the troops that come back from that front line. How do they, in a future force, what's their sort of barracks setup look like? What's the training facilities? So there's a massive amount. And that's just on the Ukrainian front before you then enable a sort of partner force that sits alongside it. There's masses out there. And then the key thing is how do you sort of look at the integration of Ukrainian defense industry? I mean, they made 5 million homemade drones, FPV drones last year. They account for more than 80% of the sort of the casualties on the front line. There's an exclusion line that sits across the sort of the forward edge of battle, all controlled by drones. How do we take that sort of Ukrainian drone technology, understanding the extraordinary innovation, how do we make that available to NATO markets? So there's lots of stuff going into Ukraine, but there's going to come a point where there's a lot of stuff coming out of Ukraine. And you've got to think about this as a sort of two-way process into the future. It's going to be.
It's true. Yeah,
going to be quite something. Yeah.
mean, a lot of people are thinking about what's going to go in, but there'll be a lot coming out. There's a lot of technology and know-how and production capacity once things settle down.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a fluid problem set right now, and I'm sure there's a lot of course of action work going on within the European capitals, within the NATO headquarters, and I think kind of looking at it from an industry perspective, it's difficult because it's fragmented. The Germans want to do this, the British want to do this, the French want to do this, the Ukrainians want to do this, there's national interest from a production capability perspective, even some distance now from American, some sovereignty discussions going on around systems now and probably around even services. So I think industry it's easy in the U.S. Department of Defense or Department of War that's the belly button to go to, and they have certain contracting mechanisms you go to get work. I think the challenge with industry is where's the funding going to come from, and how do you get set up to support it? And I think there's just some uncertainty around that right now.
Yeah, I think so, and I think so. In Ukraine is reasonably simple. So everything is driven by Ukrainian priorities and their strategy. So it's Ukraine's strategy, and they're really clear and sort of prioritized in terms of what it is they're asking for, and how we get it. So I think in the theatre is okay. I think it's when you extrapolate, it's that sort of point at which what's NATO learning from this, and I'm sort of. I routinely hear the conversation that says, days of tanks are done because drones are now new precision, cheap precision, and that the system will always defeat the platform. I'm not sure that's true, and I think the question is, what lessons are we learning? So if you could take what Ukraine's learned and done with uncrewed systems, and you match that to some of the bigger maneuver forces, and you think about how do those things come together. That could be genuinely transformation. I don't think I agree with people who say we're going through a revolution. Uncrewed is a revolution. I think it's about a system, and how do we bring together an air force that can coordinate and deliver effect with a ground force that can maneuver, that now has the ability to be able to operate uncrewed, crewed, mix things that go together, and how does science and tech sit alongside giving battlefield advantages? I think they're questions we haven't resolved. And so I think a lot of the sort of the early thinkers have sort of said, no, we've got to buy drones. You could buy a warehouse of drones, but when you come to use them, they're probably not the drones we want. And it's not the drone, it's the system that is, what's your layering of ISR, sort of electromagnetic spectrum management, your application of a suite of capabilities to be able to have target effects. And then there's a conversation that says, what's the cost point? Is it worth $1 million shot, right? Or is it actually sort of sending 1,000 sort of $500 sort of drones in a particular direction? They're conversations we need to have, and I think NATO is moving into that space. So I think NATO has been really energized by what it sees and what it understands, and how that complements its sort of suite of capabilities. And therefore, what's the industrial demand? As we put more money into NATO from across the sort of the member states, it's not just about spending the money; it's about spending the money on the right things. And this is now, I think, a defence that's gone from a long time window shopping and sort of taking time to make decisions to one that is actually engaging industry in a sort of whole system approach. Yeah, this is fundamental change. So I think the signals have been confused, but I don't think that means we're not heading in the right direction. And I think that there's a genuine energy behind this. And I think from what I see of sort of NATO organisations through national conversations, that there's a lot of thinking going into this with some bright and brilliant minds.
So I'm going to ask you to do the impossible, but it'll be interesting to hear your thought process. So I always ask the guests, let's go 3 years in the future. We're in February 2029. There's been an election in the U.S. Who knows what's happened within the different NATO member countries, and just make it go out on a limb, make a prediction. What do we look like in 2029? What does Ukraine look like? What does NATO look like? What does UK MOD posture look like?
So I'll start from Ukraine, and then I'll sort of come back from there. So I think Ukraine, the war has stopped in its current phase, and there is a line of separation and some form of sort of peace, and that's not sort of apples and sort of motherhood. That's just this is kind of, it's a unstable peace in a way, but it's holding and it is there. I think Ukraine is probably in its most vulnerable stage. So I think Ukraine in 10 years' time, if it follows its sort of regeneration sort of campaign and how it builds a sort of sovereign deterrence, 10 years they look good, but they're in a transitional phase, and that's their sort of highest risk period, where Russian forces still provide a threat and a set of capabilities they can't defend against entirely. And so this is a period of time of, people will assume when peace comes, that's brilliant, we can all step back. I think actually when peace comes, it's the point at which we've got to surge forwards, because it's the point where Ukraine has to rebuild, has to restructure, has to restock. And those things have got to happen together. It's going to cost more and it's going to take more energy. So it's going to be a point of vulnerability. The peace will bring vulnerability. So I think that's where Ukraine is. I think at the same time that, you come back to sort of, I'll start sort of UK wise. It's not a political statement, but I genuinely think there will be more money in defence. I think there will be sort of a sort of push for increasing readiness, and that's readiness. That's not in terms of just stocks of things. It's about sort of a way of fighting and readiness to do it, which gives us, sort of a drive to be to learn everything we can do from Ukraine, to be able to work with some of their industries, to bring some of their best knowledge into our inventory. And I think it probably includes, a sort of hard push to be alongside for organizational support, for regenerative support, and building closer and closer ties with us. So I think nationally, whilst Ukraine's in a vulnerable point, I think it's a point at which more money is flowing. I think there's a real sense on readiness and sort of delivery, and I can see active partnership from not only the UK but sort of allies in support of Ukraine. But I think most importantly in this is a point at which sort of NATO is on its path to it's gone from it's made the political decisions to increase capital. It is absolutely looking at its sort of posture and profile and how it builds around it. I think this is the point at which you've got NATO sort of in its next version really beginning to be on the front edge and active in terms of active deterrence and a building of sort of coherent defensive capabilities that challenge any would-be aggressor off the back end of it. So I'm sort of, I see from that point of vulnerability on the eastern flank through actually the sort of this mechanism which is driving national and multinational sort of convergence, cooperation to be able to build to it. The thing we've got to do is to be able to match some of the industrial side of what it looks like. So it's all well and good to say we're going to put money into things, but we've gone from the world of 10-year cycles for generation of exquisite capabilities. I think we're now in the business of how do we get to the minimum viable requirement on capability? How do we bring this to our inventory early? How do we test it, prove it, and how do we build a system to innovate in? And so I see a much more driven defense industry that is much more inclusive. So it's not a them and us, sort of UN money, we tell you what we want. It's a genuine integrated sort of capability set. And I think the people who are going to be at the front edge of that are the ones that sort of move from a traditional model where we banked peace for a degree to one that recognizes that national resilience, national deterrence comes from being absolutely integrated on the front edge, leading bleeding edge sort of capability development. And so I think it's a really interesting time geopolitically, and we're going to have to balance this sort of this risk that Ukraine has, and you push that forwards. You say, I'm not going to ask you about 10 years, but in 10 years' time, we get this right. We're in a brilliant place. It's in that transitional period where we hold most of the risk.
Interesting. It's kind of like a NATO 3.0. You had the Cold War NATO, you had the post-Cold War NATO, and now you have the third version of NATO, which is an energized, capitalized, as you say, NATO. Interesting. So we always like to nail down our guest to one word to describe your gut feeling about the future of our industry as it relates to Ukraine and NATO and this posture, this NATO 3.0. What's the one word you would use to describe your feeling, Adrian?
So I'm going to go two ways of this. So my one word in terms of sort of how's the system, it's going to be integration. Integration is going to be at the heart of everything that we do. Whether that's sort of integration of services, whether that's integration of knowledge, whether that's integration of capability sets. I just see integration is the thing that's come out of this recent period of conflict. But I also see, I think we've gone from a dormant defense to one that is genuinely active. Defense is no longer, it's no longer a sort of vote loser. We are now part of this whole sort of protective societies that we benefited from, and we know we've protected, but we haven't always been popular. We're going to a place where active defense. We're going to be part of the conversation, and I think that's transitional. We're going from a world where I've been proud of my service, and lots of people who know what I do, but I've not been sort of heart of the public conversation. Defense is part of public conversation,
right?
So I think we woken up. Defense industry, defense service, and that integration of those things together will be really critical to public.
Fascinating. Very good. We could talk for hours, Adrian. It's your perspective it's fresh, it's good, it's relevant, it's informed, and really, we probably are going to bring you back on once you've gone to the other side, and you'll have a little bit of a different perspective. So we definitely want to tag up here in the future and see how things have evolved.
Jake, that's brilliant. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So, to our audience out there, technically Adrian's still in, but he'll be out soon. He's in the shoot to be one of our precision experts. If you want to engage with Adrian, feel free to reach out. We can help set up a good match, a good fit for you. Certainly, if you're looking at Ukraine right now, you're looking at where to invest, how to position for the next phase. I think Adrian is probably one of the brightest minds that you could bring into your boardroom and help you come up with a good strategic plan. So feel free to reach out. And, this is a dynamic situation. We're in Krakow this week when this comes out, talking with an entire community in the defense, European defense with a C industry. And we look forward to engaging on this and also, offering bright minds like Adrian to our community. So Adrian, thanks for coming in. It's been a real pleasure to have you.
Yeah, great to see you, Jack. And thank you. Really appreciate it.
And to our audience out there, our community, tune in next week. We got a great podcast lined up for you. Hope you enjoyed this discussion. Please share this with your friends, share it with your teams, help us spread the word. We're bringing in some of the deepest expertise that helps shape where this industry is going on the Future of GovCon. So we'll see you next week. All right, so thanks for joining me on another episode of the Future of GovCon. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation and some of the bold predictions. If you did, take a second, share it on your social media, subscribe on YouTube. If you have any ideas for future guests or topics you'd like to have covered, hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm always there. You can always learn more about precision talent solutions at pts.careers. Look forward to seeing you next week on our next episode.